Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and today is episode 56, How Modern AuthZ Will Change Banking. Our guest today is Or Weiss,
Hey,
co-founder and CEO of Permit.io in Tel Aviv. Welcome, Or.
thanks. It's great being here. Hi, everyone.
And our co-host today is Dave Hyland, founder of ID Partners in Sydney. Welcome, Dave.
G'day, hello everyone. Hope you're all well.
And this is a three-continent call, which made the timing very tricky, but I think Dave got the worst end of it because it's roughly midnight in Sydney right now. So thank you, Dave, so much for joining us late.
All
And
good.
I want to start with, well, actually, I always forget to do this. Let's start with guest backgrounds. Or you're the guest. How did you end up starting an authorization company?
Well, thanks for asking. I started by working a lot as a software engineer. I started writing code at the age of 5, and then through my experience in the intelligence corps, I got more into kind of cybersecurity, and then I got into being a VP of R&D in a cybersecurity company. And then I co-founded a startup called Rookout. And while working on Rookout, which is now part of Dynatrace, I ended up rebuilding the access control to our product 5 times when the company wasn't even 3 years old. Drove me insane, as you can clearly see. That's what brought me to create Permit.io and running it as a co-founder.
Awesome. And Dave, you have a long background in identity, but maybe you can give us a quick overview of your background.
Yeah, I actually anchored in banking. Started too many years ago now, in the UK, Europe, and Australia. But recently, kind of getting deep into open banking, which I think really raises lots of challenges, which I hope we can get into a bit later on, particularly the Australian model. But most recently, living from working directly for banks and getting into my own organization, ID Partners, which we are specializing to financial institutions, trying to help them solve with digital identity, open ecosystems, including open banking, of course, and authorization.
So the topic today is on banking, and that's why I asked Dave to join us. Or before we dive into banking, I thought it might be interesting. Everyone might not have heard of Permit.io. It's a pretty new company. In my opinion, it's clearly one of the leaders in this emerging authorization space. But can you help us drill down a little bit on what problem Permit.io is trying to solve, and how does it manifest in its products from like a high 20,000 foot view?
Yeah, for sure. So anyone who's ever used software has realized that you need to control who can do what within that software. Invite other users, assign them assign them attributes, which according to which they'll be able to interact with different resources. We've been building applications since the dawn of time, and they're constantly becoming more and more complicated. Banking applications are actually a very astute example of that. And as they're becoming more complicated, their control surfaces are becoming more complicated. And so we need to find a way to do so easily. Most companies have been building authorization on their own from scratch, but they're starting to realize that just like you don't want to build a database, just like you don't want to build authentication, you don't want to build authorization. It's not unique to any company. So with Permit, our premise is never build permissions again. We provide a microservice for authorization that you embed into your software based on open source projects like OPA and Opal, Opal being a project that we created, connecting to concepts like Google Zanzibar, allowing you to manage a huge graph in the cloud for permissions, but downloading subsets of it into that microservice for authorization that runs within your system. So you get zero latency, high availability, and the ability to generate policies on the fly as you go with both APIs, Terraform provider, and a low-code interface that I like to say a monkey can use, or even a product manager if they're smart enough. That joke, by the way, goes best with product managers. And that's, I'd say, the long story short version of it.
Since you're the CEO, I'm gonna throw one more sort of business question at you before we go into banking.
Sure.
Put you on the spot as CEO, but the authorization space has been around for a long time. As you mentioned, since the dawn of time, we've been struggling with access control.
Mm-hmm.
And it sort of never really evolved into a huge market. Um, but recently, there's been a number of startups in this area, and I think you have a theory that this is about to change, that the authorization space is going to experience more rapid growth. My question is, why now?
I think it's basically an evolution tree or a tech tree. It's like you can say, oh, we've had wheels for ages, but we didn't get into cars just up till very recently in human history, though we could have used them before. And there are two, I think, main prerequisites. One is an enabling one. Before you have identity management and authentication mature enough, there isn't really a point in building authorization because it depends on those layers and they need to be trustworthy enough and malleable enough so they can enable the authorization layer. And secondly, it's a matter of complexity. If you have a simple application where you just need like maybe just access control lists or maybe just a couple of roles, it doesn't hurt you too much to build it from scratch. But as more and more requirements come in, as your permissions need to be more fine grained, and you find yourself moving into models like ABAC and REBAC and PBAC, and actually in reality mixing between them constantly. And as you need to implement a lot of authorization experiences, like one user can ask permissions from another. One user can trigger an action, another user can approve it. The ability to create roles on the fly. A lot of classic experiences that nowadays are the bread of and butter of applications, but even just 5 years ago, it would be pretty rare, even in corporate and in very mature applications, it'd be rare to find these. Now you find them all over the place. So as the baseline for authorization for identity is rising for all applications, the standard that we want to start with needs to rise as well.
So, Dave, I want to pivot this into banking. You've been part of a number of assessments at banks looking at the best authorization platform to choose. So, before we get into who was selected and why, what were some of the important use cases or requirements that banks were looking to solve?
Yeah, there's been changing. Just going back to some of the complexity that's been evolving. There are two areas, right? There's the consumer channel, and in Australia, it's been complicated by open banking. And that's because a lot of consent-based delegations and the complexity around the rules associated with data sharing and privacy and those sorts of things. And then on the other end of the spectrum, in terms of a banking domain, you've got the institutional banking, the corporate customers, the ones where you've got large organizations with hundreds of, I guess, entities in that organization with lots of other people who are acting on their behalf, government organizations and stuff like that. So they have a large inherent complexity, and they also have audit departments that might be involved in there too. What banks want to do is provide those customers the ability to go in and manage their banking properly. So those platforms, like the corporate platforms and even the consumer platforms, they kind of were the digital channels were put down a long time ago. I mean, I've been in one bank recently and we've lost the code to the VB6. That's how old, and they're still kind of hanging together in that technology. But they're getting to the age now where the bank's customers, the big corporates, are saying, we need these features. We need to be able to have delegated payment authorities lasting for certain periods of time. We want to have our own corporate governance structures embedded in the permissions in our banking to create Chinese walls within our organization for our banking as well. So they're the sorts of requirements that customers are coming to banks and saying, this is what we need. So for most of these large organizations that have these big corporate type of customers, they are saying, well, look, we've got to change what we're doing. And they have put down some entitlement or some sort of complexity in their channels, but it's very popping up in spreadsheets, driven by spreadsheets or driven by code or hard coded into things. So they are dealing with a long heritage of code. But as I said, we're getting to the point just in the evolution of digital channels and technologies that they are pulling these things apart and saying we need to do better. And certainly complexity drives kind of performance concerns. And these are the sorts of things that when we're looking at how do we address them, they're the characteristics of the platforms we need to look at. Yeah. They're the sorts of things we need to look at. How do we solve for those complexities?
Or what are you seeing as requirements from the banking financial sector? And maybe we should throw a slightly wider net than banking and talk about like insurance or brokerage or other financial services in general.
Yeah. I'd say, first of all, you can even widen this group to the group of companies that have to deal with significant compliance. And by the way, that group by itself is constantly growing because we're adding more compliance on everything. But I think it's extremely apparent with the fintech industry and with banking at that top line. The healthcare industry is also going in that direction. And I'm seeing it through the lens of the permit customers. We have dozens of banks using our open source. We have several banks that are paying customers. And I think at this point in time, we're like in the pipeline, we have like another 10 banks that are in advanced POC stages, and all of them are constantly coming with more and more requirements. And I see two types of processes where they are coming with this to the table. One is the kind of leadership driven, strategy driven, saying we've been working with this IAM platform that we had for a while. Now we need to face new challenges. We need to refactor, rethink how we do identity access management across the table. So we're going to build a new project, a new platform, so the entire bank can move to that. And those are like huge projects that they're planning to spend over, in most cases, years. And we're also seeing new greenfield opportunities or refactor opportunities to existing applications that have new business requirements, managing not just an account, but a family cell, or managing a offering for businesses, or managing things like with new capabilities like open banking. These put in immediate requirements that require addressing, and with the needs for stability, performance, and the granular level of permissions on a ever-growing field, those push banks to reevaluate what they have on the table, and a lot of times it forces them to adopt new technologies. Most of them have already, most of the banks we talk to at least, have already started exploring open source solutions. There you mostly see things like OPA, Open Policy Agent, our own Opal. Cedar from AWS has also got a few shiny spots where it's well, shining. And you were seeing a little bit um, of kind of Google Zanzibar implementations, but I think policy as code is still primarily the way that I think fintech organizations are leaning to, as opposed to policy as graph. But that's a whole conversation by itself.
So, Dave, one of the homework readings was a McKinsey global survey of APIs in banking, and roughly 75% of the bank APIs were used for internal purposes, and banks were planning to double the number of internal APIs within the next 5 years. And there are also external-facing APIs. Is the growth of API usage one of the major challenges banks are facing? And also wondering about the intersection with API gateway products.
Oh, wow. There's a lot in that.
Yeah.
I did my first, was at one large bank that had a very API big strategy, and they put in a big service mesh and mostly addressing about how do they optimize the way they deliver code and deliver change and get the agility in the actual APIs and the modularity that they want in terms of building their platforms. Authorization wasn't really the first thing they led with. It was more about the compute, and a lot of organizations are trying to create these multi-cloud type of compute layers for whatever regulatory compliance or material workload type of concerns they're trying to address. So it's been more about the compute first, but more recently, yes, of course, how do we deal with the authorization? Now, where it gets really, really, really interesting, and you get some really, really interesting debates, is when you start having conversations of these people building these service mesh type of platforms. But then we start talking about people trying to build open banking APIs or channel APIs, which service mesh kind of looks at north, south, east, west type of traffic between the different nodes within the Kubernetes clusters. But then you have the actual channel guys more worried about, well, how do we enforce the actual business rules and those sorts of things on the edge? So therefore, and what I've discovered is that right now, particularly in the product development market and the sorts of use cases or problems that they're trying to solve. There's a whole spectrum of authorization, some which are really good at doing business-based type of decisioning. Like we are a Ping partner, and we've done a lot of work with Ping Authorize, all the way back to OPA, right? Maybe that's probably a bad way of positioning, but very engineering-led, low-level type of simple, quite quick decisions at more of a lower level, whereas big complex customer decisions over here. So these large organizations, you get these large spectrums of authorization problems, and therefore people trying to get one solution, which I don't think is the right way. I think large organizations need to address different problems with different answers, and there's not just one big hammer. So that's a lot of the challenges that we face is in trying to come and say, look, we're trying to solve a big business problem over here. OPA's probably not the best in just the open source form. Let's look at a different product. But, that product up here, Ping Authorized, probably isn't best for your east-west traffic within your actual mesh. So that's what there's some of the topics that all the organizations are facing is, well, what is the problem we're trying to solve? And of course that gets even harder the more higher up the executive ladder you get to try to explain, well, why are we doing this, why are we spending this money here, and what about that there too?
Yeah, I'd love to double click on that if I can. So I completely agree with Dave, and I think one of the most prominent things that I'm seeing, especially with banking, is the need to create a unified control plane. And most of them understand that the customer-facing needs, their internal workforce needs, their more engineering needs, they're varied, and they have different levels of technical ability for the different players around these different categories, and they have different requirements, and they have different tools and surfaces that they need to apply this to. So it's almost impossible to have one silver bullet that will cover everything. So the idea is really about building the processes, and I think even in more particular, the SDLC, the software development life cycles, that will allow all the different surfaces to connect to a unified control plane that the bank as a whole can have a conversation around and propagate capabilities from there. And there, I think it's really about providing the right processes and within them the right interfaces for the right people. So, for example, in Permit, we are not saying, oh, everyone should write policies code. I think that's nonsense. I think most engineers, no offense to anyone, but I think most engineers are not able to write policies code with something like Rego. So we try to provide APIs, we try to provide infrastructure as code, and we try to provide no-code interfaces. And it's really about the people and how they work with the technology more than just the one fell swoop where you throw in an engine and say, okay, all our problems are solved now.
Yeah. I mean, the pervasiveness of these APIs are driving requirements from all different directions, from different layers and different concerns, which I think, having that kind of unified control plane or doing it in that way to have like, as I said, at the moment, I don't think there is one big hammer. I think that you really need to look at what are the problems and how you're trying to solve it. But of course, every organization wants to solve it once, which is the contention.
Dave, what do you see as the biggest challenges? Because, Or and I are both sort of on the product vendor side, but you're actually working with real customers. And all of this, I think that you'll find that in the vendor space, there's almost axiomatic agreement that externalizing policies is a good thing. Every AuthZ and identity vendor thinks that. But what are some of the biggest challenges when that sort of axiomatic truth meets the real world that banks are actually facing and trying to roll out authorization? And I realize you're just going to have to
look, there's a lot of
this one.
Again, it's education and knowledge. This is a pretty new domain, and there's lots of new smaller platforms out there in Australia in particular. Ping is everywhere. Ping now ForgeRock. If it wasn't Ping, it's now ForgeRock, so it's all the same thing. So there is kind of like a big leaning on these sort of on the Ping platform. Of course, there are other players out there, like Permit and all the others that are out there. And there's, so from an assessment and bringing those into a side-by-side, it makes it very hard for a decision because, as I said, I think that they are probably targeting different problems, and banking has a big, hairy problem. But I think the biggest problem that banks are having to solve is actually the complex business problems that they need to untangle, and then getting the data to help make those decisions next to where the decision needs to be made. We've noticed with open banking that the biggest problem that they had to solve was that we had to bring, so look, Australia had a CDR regime which covered about 90-something% of all the financial products in market. Everything, asset finance, corporate, everything, right? So that meant particularly the big ones, spent a lot of money, hundreds of millions of dollars of trying to bring the data together. And then we had to make a decision about how do we authorize that data, and how do we also make sure that the data that we have is up to date, because we don't want to share data if that account's not open, or we need to make sure the transaction's there really quick because that's what the rule said. So the biggest problem I think that we have, and we're going to have going forward, is how can we get a really current state, up-to-date view of the data that's accurate and complete, and also structured in a way that allows us to make quick decisions. So this is where we are. A lot of banks over here are looking at graph-based decisions. And therefore, we are getting into the realm of, well, which graph? Do we want a Zanzibar or LDF type of relational type of model? Or can we do a richer graph and get more optimized queries on? So I think banks are a little bit tentative to kind of jump into new technologies. So they are preferring to make, hey, look, we've got Neptune here. We can throw ping authorized and some graph queries on top. So that's kind of where the market, where banks are thinking right now. But they are also saying, well, what fintechs are out there? Now, even though they're saying what fintechs are out there, what no one's answering is how do they bring and create and conform the data to allow the policies to be effectively written and executed on top. So data and the correlating of data across a large complex organization, it's clearly a large complex organization problem, but that's one of the biggest problems that banks are trying to solve.
Yeah. And or
Takes
I'm
up a lot of
going to
my
let you, I know you're going to be chomping at the bit at that one, but let me just focus it a little bit. You know, when I first saw Permit.io, I almost thought it was more of a data pipeline company than an authorization company, because a lot of the value of Permit is bringing the data to the PDP that you need to make a decision.
Right.
So I want to let you riff on that a little bit, but I also wanted to maybe throw in there from your vendor perspective, what do you see as the biggest challenges in the financial sector?
Yeah. So I'll address those two questions in two parts. So first of all, I agree with Dave. The problem of getting the data and aligning the data with the authorization layer is one of the biggest. It suffers both from technical challenges and also organizational challenges, because a lot of times I see engineers and I see architects. One of the classic pitfalls that people do with building authorizations for applications is taking the existing data layer and connecting it to the authorization layer. And that usually looks well because the application is like, you have the users in the application and you have the different resources that they're interacting with there. So I'll just run a few more queries against that and that will be fine. But as time moves ahead, the requirements of the authorization layer and the requirements of the application start to drift. And then the performance of the application dies, and the ability to cater to the authorization layer fails, and the SLAs don't align, and everything just screeches to a halt. And then you have a new project to refactor the entire thing before you run out of time, because it's already taking queries seconds instead of microseconds or milliseconds. And so I think the most important best practices that we have is using a replicating pattern where we create a data layer for the authorization layer that is deriving the data that it needs from the application and other external data sources. And this is actually one of the key things that we identified when we try to start building Permit. We saw we have these amazing policy engines. We have OPA, later we had Cedar, you have Casbin, you have Axiomatics, you have Ping Authorized, you have a lot of solutions. You have SailPoint, but how do I make sure that they have the right data and the right policies to authorize things in a dynamic, constantly growing world? And this is why we created OPAL, Open Policy Administration Layer. And what it does is you configure it to run in the background and make sure that each policy engine gets the data and policies that it needs, and it uses a replicator pattern to bring the data as close as possible to each of those policy decision points. And that's, as we said, it's an open source project. Everyone can use it for multiple policy engines, and we're constantly adding more. So you've got OPA, you've got Cedar, you've got AVP. Soon you'll have OpenFGA, and other engines are coming in there. And it's a generic, standardized way to build data fetchers that bring data from sources and restructure them for the authorization layer. And it's a key part in how Permit works, and how we are able to cater to all of our different customers that have different, very varied and constantly surprising data sources and data layouts and data requirements. And I think that's kind of a key crux of this matter. Like, if we want to solve authorization, it's about creating the right interconnectivity between the data sources and the various multiple engines that we're going to need to enforce access on our different surfaces. And in the end of the day, when moving in kind of into the second part of your question, even when you have these tools, it's really not about the technology. So we come into a lot of these organizations, and they want to implement OPA, or they want to implement a Google Zanzibar implementation, or they want to implement Permit. And they're almost always, their biggest challenge is one, well, something we already touched on, is how you create a data connectivity. But the second one is sometimes even a more crucial killer. How do you migrate the existing applications? So they have already some kind of homebrew authorization in place. They already have some dependencies with other systems, and they have constant requirements that are coming in now. And we find that this is a lot of times can be paralyzing for organizations. I won't mention names, but a large healthcare provider who's now a customer of ours, they initially started a project to adopt OPA on their own, and they were stuck on it for literally 2 years. Not because the technology wasn't viable for them, not because they didn't have architectural plans on how to implement this, but because the area that they needed to cover and migrate was so big that they couldn't make the right decisions. And where we help them, aside from bringing them a product that speeds everything up, is we're about being able to sit down with them, bring in the best practices and expertise, and say, this is how you do this gradually. This is how you build consensus in your organization. This is how you build proof within from concepts into showing that this works for your real scenarios and providing real business value now, as opposed to 6 months from now, where the requirements will already change. And I find that that's one of the biggest problems that organizations are facing.
Yeah, the people. So Dave, we were talking about data and graphs, and but what about in the mobile app? I actually threw in an article. I couldn't find a lot about this, but I threw in an article about bank mobile apps just to sort of raise the question. A graph-based solution is great, but it sort of requires access to the cloud. But there's this whole class of mobile applications out there which the people have in their hands. And those mobile applications also need authorization decisions, like whether or not to display a certain form or allow, there's all sorts of authorization decisions in the apps. And these banking apps are like the most critical mobile apps that we use, basically, the most, let's say, sensitive from a security perspective. How do we bridge this authorization layer down to the mobile app? Is that something banks are thinking about? And and what are the strategies maybe that we need to adjust in order to improve there?
Yeah, I mean, the banks are thinking, absolutely. We call it entitlements. And not only are they thinking about it, but it's also, I think it's strongly aligned with some of the things that certainly I've been looking at recently around rich authorization requests in terms of tokenizing an entitlement, hosting it on the client, and then allowing the client to adapt to the whatever that token is in it, the rich authorization request with all the information about the entitlement of the JOT. And then we're also looking at some other work to do continuous evaluation by the client. So the client, with any kind of request that it makes, can continuously evaluate the certain state of entitlement that it has to, again, continuously adapt. There are some this is part of what I think we'd hope to move more in the part of the AuthZ working group, and some of the externalization of this information to provide signals about what you can do. Even if you can't do it, if you get a denial, well, you can do this. These are all about providing richer information back to the client, back to the mobile app, to be able to tell the mobile app what you can do. Within an existing client now, we're trying to pull together, actually create an enterprise grade entitlement platform that uses ping IDM, the old ForgeRock IDM, to conform the data from the hundreds of different sources that the bank has into a graph. And then we, ID Partners, have built a graph accelerator kit. And what that allows us to do is to create what can I requests. So the client can render, or can basically query this database, this API, hits the graph. It can tell you what accounts you have and what you can do with it. And that information obviously is then cached on the client and used to render the experience in the client. So yeah, there's lots of the banks are absolutely looking at that. And it's closely
Wouldn't there be a
coupled to the
performance hit
authorization.
there, though? If you send this request in the mobile app, you're always looking at, a round trip. And so what is how much of that can you really do in the app? And is there a concern about performance of hitting the graph, and what might happen if that is lost?
Well, the graph's super quick, right? So we've seen corporate accounts that can return hundreds of accounts from nodes of 400,000 or more in less than 200 milliseconds. So really the response of actually bringing back those packets of the what can you do is really, really quick. And no more than what these banking apps are doing today anyway. So there are some additional calls in here, absolutely, but it's all been sequenced as part of the user journey and part of the experience. And having a graph behind it gives you super quick responses about what you can do, which previously would have been too hard to do accurately. And of course, the richness of a graph can give you a whole lot more about not just what accounts you can see, but what attributes of it can you actually perform, what actions you might be able to perform on that account too.
I know a permit has a front end, whether you call it front end product, but I'm curious if you had any thoughts on what are some of the opportunities here for banks, or what are some of the unique challenges that banks might face in the authorization space when they're actually building that mobile app?
Yeah, I'll start by saying that, first of all, I've been doing several RFIs and RFPs, and I think without missing a beat, each and every one of them included adjusting the front end experience as part of the requirements for the authorization layer, and sometimes with great detail. So I'm very confident in saying that yes, this is buffering a lot of banks, and it's rather high on their requirements list, both for mobile and web applications. And when I'm thinking, at least on this problem, I think it's basically built of three parts. One part is the authorization aspect itself within the application, how you make sure that what the application is allowed to do is actually enforced correctly, and I'll elaborate on that in a second. How you adjust the experience in the front end that will be a good experience for the application user. And lastly, how you connect this with the authorization application's flow. So you're not just putting in your front end controls of what they can do and not for authorization. You're also putting in controls for the authorization itself, aka the ability to view roles, the ability to view audit logs, the ability to create requests for permissions, etc. All of these things need to play well together. Otherwise, everyone's having a bad time. The end users, the developers building this, the front-end developers, the security team, this all needs to chime in well very, very precisely. So to go over these 3 points and kind of elaborate, the first part, and I think is the most important because it's the most fundamental and crucial. We need the right best practices here, and we need to make sure that everyone understands that there isn't really such a thing as authorization on the front end. In the front end, I think it's more correct to say that you're doing feature flagging or you're doing experience adjusting, but the front end lives on the customer side, lives on the other side of the barrier, and you can't fully control it. It can be subverted by the end user, so you can never trust it, no matter what you do, how much you encrypt it, how much you encode it, how much safeguards you put into the code. So you always have to do the actual authorization on your backend, and there you need to deliver
Can I
the
just
right.
interject for 1 second?
Yes,
And that aligns with zero trust principles, right? We're going to
correct.
do security everywhere. So I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to get in my pitch for zero trust, that I think you're aligned with also. Yeah.
100%, 100%. Now we say, okay, we actually enforce the actions in the backend, but we need the backend to be able to provide to the front end the right guidelines for it to work and perform in the way that it needs. So we need performance on the authorization queries themselves. And here we have three types. We have the can someone do something? What can that someone do? And the filtering of data. Out of the data that is available, what am I allowed to send to the front end application? This subtopics to explore: data filtering and partial evaluation. And now you send this to the front-end application. How can the front-end application work with this in a way that is efficient to it? And here I'm starting to see two categories evolve. One is the feature flagging category, saying feature flagging is already a huge set of products in the market. It has
Mhm.
evolved dramatically. It's already useful. We just need to connect the dots. There we started to explore this with an open source project that we called optoggles, which literally takes the state that you have from OPA, boils it down to feature flags, and pushes it into the feature flagging solution. For example, Launch Darkly or Grovebook or whatever. Um, and the other category that I'm seeing is getting adjusted data from the backend, but having the front end make decisions on top of it as well. And there, by the way, I think we're seeing great projects like the Cedarling that you go folks at Glue have promoted. And
One day we'll launch. Yeah.
you already put some open source out there. I think that's a significant step in promoting the industry. And I think the smarter we can make the front end, and the better we can have it communicate with the backend without actually making the mistake of turning the front end into an authorization component, we can allow front end developers to have powerful experiences on top of the actual authorization in the backend. And lastly, how do we provide the front-end developers with interfaces that they can easily plug into their applications? I'm thinking of these as kind of like you have components in React. How do you have a component that allows people to view a user? How do you have a component to ask for requests for access? How do you allow people to view policy, etc.?
Yeah.
And I'll
I think
pause there.
there's a missing piece here that I've been digging into. So we've been focusing largely, we talk about the policy decision points, the policy administration point, policy enforcement point. I actually think that we haven't quite got the PEP thing right. I think we're focused largely on the policy enforcement point, but what we're missing and what we've been looking at is the policy inquiry point. It essentially does the same thing as a policy enforcement point, but before you enforce it. The last thing we want is to send back lots of 403s, or we want to be sending back 200s. But the client won't know about that unless it's calling some other API to figure it out. So the better way of doing it is the authorization server is there, right? Right now, the authorization server mostly deals with what the client can do. But the introduction of the rich authorization request standard actually starts burrowing through to what the actual subject can do. So I think that we've been looking at how can we use the grant management API is another new OIDF standard, relatively new, that came out in open back of open banking. But I think that needs to be extended a bit further to allow authorization evaluations to take place by the client. So it can say, what can I do before it goes and does it? Right. So it provides a standardized interface to inform the client in the standardized way about what it can do. And then that gives the client the ability with a richly kind of annotated swagger, which could describe all of this, to allow it to start figuring out, well, what do I need to do, right, to get there? So there's some really interesting developments. And I think this policy enforcement, policy inquiry point, that's going to become a thing, I hope. As long as we can actually
we'll have to think
get
of
the
a new
standards
name
right.
because PIP is currently policy information point, which is like basically the database. So you'll have
Yeah.
to think of a new letter. But
Exactly.
we only have a couple minutes left. I'm sorry, or you want to follow up on that?
I just threw in pimp, IN.
I, I mean, technically, I think actually what you're talking about is moving the PDP to the edge, and so that the application has more direct access um, to the PDP without having to make a round trip. But let's not digress. I want to get this one last. This is a left field question, and you might have no idea how to answer it, Dave. But there's been a lot of innovation. We've been talking a lot about authorizing people, but I think as an industry, there's been a movement towards looking at workload authorization. So what we might call machine to machine, or it has all these names. I basically think this is just software trying to I call it software identity, but let's call it workload identity. Um, do you see this use case in banks? And do you see them thinking about some of the challenges around workload identity and specifically workload authorization? I'm just curious if this is on the radar.
Probably not in those terms. What they are trying to look at is how they deal with zero trust in some way. They haven't, and they have all done some work in trying to manage their APIs, if you like, which kind of the APIs and the API clients internally. That's still a journey for them. But again, we need to, a lot of the focus is on how do you get through the channel first. It is still very much a hard outer core, but we are thinking about, well, okay, so how would we do zero trust without boiling the ocean? The governance and tools and those aspects of how internal services consume other services in these complex organizations is still kind of, we're quite good at creating directories, but can we properly do proper client lifecycle management in terms of like service to service lifecycle management? That's still from an OAuth or a security authorization perspective, and also kind of domain-based policy within the enterprise, still years away. I think there's bigger problems to solve before those ones.
Any thoughts on that? Or, I mean, I know you permit always says, entity, person being like, but are you starting to see this in the real world from clients where we're moving not just to person authorization, but workload or client authorization?
I think currently it's still mostly viewed around API key management, API security, service to service connectivity, those kind of things. But first of all, I'm seeing this growing very quickly. More and more companies that we're talking to are putting that element as part of their requirements. But I think more interestingly, and here I'm kind of trying to glimpse into the future, I think this would become a very, very significant part of how we do authorization with the evolution of technology and primarily with AI. And when I'm trying to think about this problem, I think there are two important do and don't that we need to make sure that we have going forward. One, do be able to treat both human identities and artificial identities with the same level of policies and granularity. Because in the end of the day, a couple of minutes from now, AIs are going to be doing all the things that your human users are doing, and our human users are going to be using AI to use all of the features that exist. So you're going to have full mash of humans and artificial identities using everything. And if you start separating them, you'll, in just a couple of years from now, at the best case scenario, you'll find yourself trying to recouple them again. So do be able to have your policy address all agents equally. Don't give the same authority to them. So all automated agents have to have their authority driven from some human entity. And there, I think it's just like basic philosophy. Before we let Skynet take over directly, we need to make sure that we humans still have some stake in the game and the ability to control things.
You're talking about governance, basically. We still need to govern AI, unless we get to Terminator 4. So
Yeah,
that's very interesting, or I think it's a good point. Yeah.
And more concretely, just to kind of round up the point here, and more concretely, so when we do an authorization decision, we should be able to say, okay, this is the identity acting. This is what the policy says that the entity is allowed to do according to the world picture and data. But part of that world picture and data should be, where is the authority of this identity coming from? And for an AI agent, you should be able to say, this AI agent is acting on behalf of Dave, on behalf of Mike, and not on its own accord. And that should be a crucial part of the policy itself.
Well, this authorization is obviously one of my favorite topics. We're running over just a little bit. So let's move to last thoughts. Dave, we'll start with you. Any last thoughts?
Well, look, lots of work to do. Look, I'm hoping that we can do more and more out of the authorization, the AuthZ working group, the standardization. And I think what we do there isn't just trying to standardize vendors, but we are really trying to externalize and standardize the way that clients can consume this stuff too. So hopefully we can see some more interesting things coming out after this latest interop. We can reach in some signals back to the client.
And Or, last thoughts?
I'm very excited to see this space evolving. I think in the short couple of years that I've been vested completely into it, I saw it change dramatically and constantly see its pace increasing. I think we're at the cusp of a really pivotal moment in its life, driven by AI, driven by all of these solutions, and like Dave said, by the standards that are emerging in the market and allowing everyone to come in and play on the same playing field. And I'll just say that I'm excited to that, and I invite everyone watching us to chat with me about it. I'm easy to reach both on LinkedIn and in Permit's Slack community. And if you like hearing me ramble, also check out Command Shift Left, which is a developer podcast that I like to host.
And Permit.io has a lot of great content. And yeah, a quick plug. I need to do a whole AuthZ episode, actually. Maybe we'll do that in 2025. And I'll just make a quick plug. The one application I'm really excited for AuthZ about is API gateways. Right now, I feel like every API gateway has a different way that they do authorization, and it's driving the API gateway vendors crazy. And if they could have one authorization API to plug into the multiple PDPs, that would be amazing. So thank you for your work at 4 a.m., Dave, contributing on the AuthZ work group. And I know Permit.io is also doing great work there.
Yes.
Glue actually joined AuthZ late, but so we'll chime in and ask
More
for that.
than
Yeah, I'm about to ask for .wellknown/AuthZ configuration endpoint.
Don't joke.
So, anyway, stuff's happening in AuthZ.
It is.
Next week, we have two legends of decentralized identity, Marcus Sabadello and Drummond Reed, I hope. So we'll see. Drummond might be in China, but I think he's available. If not, we'll just have Marcus, which will be fine. So anyway, I just want to thank the audience for hanging in there a couple extra minutes. Thank you, Or. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, audience. And we'll see you next time.